Hello, everyone. Welcome. Well, welcome to the Kislak Center, but also to the Wolf Humanities Center, which is delighted to host this talk. My name is Jamal Ilyas. I'm the director of the Wolf Humanities Center, and I'm absolutely delighted that we have this event with Professor Ted Underwood, entitled "Why AI Needs the Humanities as a Partner," which is, I think, an excellent and timely topic for a lot of us. So I'm actually not going to introduce Ted Underwood, my colleague, Lisa Mitchell, who is, she's a professor and the chair of the South Asia Studies Department, and she's also the topic director for the year at the Wolf Humanities Center, something I will explain what that means in a second. So first, a tiny bit about the Wolf Humanities Center. It's the Humanities Center of the University of Pennsylvania, and we function on the basis of an annual topic. All our events are not on that topic, but we do have a topic which is proposed by a person who becomes the topic director, which is what Lisa Mitchell is this year. And the topic for this year is keywords. And this this afternoon's sort of talk and discussion is one of the events in that series of topically related to keywords things. And we do, I mean, again, the Humanities Center does a lot of different kind of programming. We run 2 different research seminars all year long. So one is actually a professional seminar. It brings together faculty from other institutions in the area, postdocs, and people who are finishing their dissertations, their PhD dissertations, in a weekly seminar. We also have an undergraduate seminar that meets every 2 weeks, well, more or less. And then at the end of the academic year in spring sometime, both of these seminars have conferences. And then in addition to that, there's obviously talks, bringing people in for these wonderful events such as this one, and many, many other things, including co-sponsorships, fundings, a lot goes on. So, I mean, it's a delight to be doing this. I'm not going to talk much more about this. And we're supported by a lot of different funding networks. It's called the Wolf Humanities Center because we have a donor named Dick Wolf, who is the title donor. For those of you who don't know, Dick Wolf is Mr. Law and Order. And Chicago Fire and SVU and a few other things, but there's also there's the Hershey Foundation, Hershey Family Foundation, which is another major donor. We have several other things, including National Endowment for Humanities, the university, and other things I won't sort of like name forever. But before I leave and I give over the podium to Lisa, I just want to first thank my colleagues at the Wolf Humanities Center, without whom such events are just not possible. So that would be Sarah Varney, Erin Bailey, Pamela Horn, and Angelina Klimensberg. So Lisa, all yours.
Thank you so much, Jamal. And I think we also want to thank the Price Lab for co-sponsoring the event today. It's my great honor and pleasure to be able to introduce to you our speaker for tonight, Professor Ted Underwood. Professor Underwood is Professor of Information Sciences and also Professor of English at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His work has devoted careful attention to ways of applying machine learning to large digital collections, and also to thinking about how to correct and enrich and make usable large digital collections to make them more usable for us. He's the author of 3 books on literary history. His first book, The Work of the Sun on Literature, Science, and Political Economy, was published in 2005. His second book, Why Literary Periods Mattered, Historical Contrast and the Prestige of English Studies, in 2013 from Stanford University Press, and most recently, Distant Horizons, Digital Evidence and Literary Change, published by the University of Chicago in 2019. In addition to these books, he's published scads of articles in venues like Sociological Science, the Journal of Cultural Analytics, Digital Humanities Quarterly, Modern Language Quarterly, Big Data and Society, the Association for Computational Linguistics, New Literary History, Representations, and the Journal of Digital Humanities, as well as more outward-facing or popular-facing periodicals like the Chronicle for Higher Education and Slate. His current project, about which I think he's going to speak a little bit tonight, involves building language models that incorporate viewpoint diversity and cultural change as central principles. And his title today is AI and the Humanities as Partners, but I think we're also going to learn about why AI needs the humanities. So please join me in welcoming Professor Underwood.
My goal today is to convey what I hope will be good news. This is not a sort of I share my latest research talk so much as it is let's collectively hopefully be cheered up a bit. I think this is an exciting moment, a moment when new doors are opening for the study of human culture. But I also want to start by acknowledging that there are reasons to feel that the study of culture doesn't have a bright future, or at least that the interaction of AI with culture is troubling. The last couple of decades have been difficult in general for the humanities. Enrollments have trended down in many fields. And into that picture, what arrived in 2022 was ChatGPT, a new generative AI tool that many students started to use to do their homework. Beyond the sort of concrete instructional adjustments that professors had to do in response to that, I think there's a broader sense that generative AI tools like ChatGPT are undermining the symbolic value of education and culture of the humanities by automating or pretending to automate things like writing and art. So these are legitimate concerns. We could add others. I imagine the question session will add others, and I'm not going to make an effort to downplay them. I just think that there's also something at the bottom of Pandora's box that we could talk about. There are some new possibilities emerging connected to AI that could give us hope, even if all those other problems remain. And I'm going to be a little heavy-handed about this Pandora's box framing, because I know a question you will have in your mind as I talk is, all this hopeful stuff is nice, but does it outweigh the negative? When is he going to talk about the negative issues associated with AI and decide what the balance is? Does the good outweigh the bad? And I want to be really clear at the outset that I'm not going to promise to outweigh anything. Weighing the benefits and downsides of a new technology is really hard. Consider something like heavier than air flight. Good or bad, it brought me here today, but if we look at the burning Amazon or just walk the streets of Dresden and Hiroshima, the verdict might not be straightforward. If it's not easy to come to a verdict about technologies like internal combustion and flight after more than a century, there's no chance that I'm going to be able to tell you whether the effect of generative AI will be good or bad prospectively. So my goal today is much more modest. I will try to describe a possible upside that I don't think most of us have explored yet. No promise that it outweighs the downside, but I hope there will be some new information here. So generative AI, what is the upside for humanists? I'm going to say briefly that generative AI works by modeling culture, that its challenges and things you have to do to improve it tend to involve questions about culture. And this is maybe the key part, and the part where I think people may not know this yet, that humanists and computer scientists alike have recognized that the humanities have a central role to play in addressing these challenges. So there are big opportunities emerging here, and I'm sanguine that people who study culture will take advantage of them, or even have already started to. But there are also challenges and caveats at every stage of this. So let's work through the argument and acknowledge the problems. First of all, what does it mean to say generative AI works by modeling culture? I think this is actually a little, I may be able to go a little quicker here than I would have a year or two ago, because I think this is an argument a lot of people have heard now, and there are several different ways into it. One way into this is to start by being skeptical about the idea that what we've got here is a model of intelligence. So for instance, Alison Gopnik, who's a psychologist who works on children, was skeptical that these AI models are capable of doing what the children she works on can do, which is quickly explore a new domain and draw high-level causal inferences. She's skeptical that the models are intelligent in even the sense that a child is intelligent. But she acknowledges what they're useful for by conceding that they are cultural technologies. What she means by a cultural technology is something that transmits patterns of behavior, that reproduces them, like language itself, or writing, or libraries. They're not capable of innovating, but they can reproduce culture. For computer scientists who've seen themselves as trying to solve a fundamental riddle about the nature of intelligence, that's a somewhat deflating conclusion. And I think, frankly, Gopnik intends it to be deflating. But it doesn't have to be viewed as deflating. I've argued in a piece you see here that from the perspective of the humanities, this isn't disappointing at all. Modeling culture, collective behavior, is not a consolation prize that computer scientists get because they failed to model the really important things that happen in individual brains. Collective patterns of behavior, like language and techniques of chipping flint, are kind of central to the whole hominid shtick, have been central to our success, and in my view, they would deserve much of the credit that we give to the concept of intelligence. And the fact that computer scientists finally found success, not with artificial intelligence, as the 1950s imagined it, but with language models, vindicates a thesis that the humanities spent much of the 20th century developing. The piece of this that is clearest, and I think people have probably heard about by now, is an analogy between the way chatbots work and the way Roland Barthes claimed that human authors work in The Death of the Author. Barthes is clearly right in some ways to say that texts don't have to be produced by authors. They're produced by other texts. We can see that like in a very literal way now. Language models have made clear that texts can be, as Barthes puts it, a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings blend and clash. And this is, it's a popular connection because there's something kind of funny about saying that chatbots have killed the author if Barthes hadn't already done it. But I'm not interested in talking just about Barthes here, or even just about structuralism in the 1960s. I think there's a much longer history here where writers, critics, linguists, philosophers throughout the 20th century developed what I would call a collective theory of meaning, based on the premise that the meaning of human actions is grounded less in mental states than in collective patterns of behavior. To illustrate this, we could talk about Wittgenstein's language games or Saussure's langue, but we can also point to less official, less formal and philosophical texts like Forster's Aspects of the Novel, and where he has an anecdote about a lady who says, "Don't talk to me about logic. How can I know what I think until I see what I say?" And this is kind of it seems to me apt for the turn that artificial intelligence took, because they started out thinking that they were going to have to model logic. And instead, in fact, language models really just, they find out what they think by predicting the next word and seeing what they say. Displacing agency from the individual author to language or culture was one of the central ways that 20th century writers celebrated cultural production. The structuralists maybe took it furthest and were most provocative about it, but programmatic claims about the death of the subject were palatable and appealing because they were rooted in this longer tradition of acknowledging that human innovation really comes from doing things in cultural systems, not all from up here. We can take it back to Mallarmé. The pure work implies the disappearance of the poet speaking, words themselves take the initiative. And I would say, for me, this tradition, this is what drew me to the humanities. This is what makes the humanities exciting. The recognition that human life is not something that has a fixed internal definition, but has infinite potentials that can only be understood concretely through the historical unfolding of what human beings are in concrete institutions and creative expression. That's the only way we find out what we're capable of. That's a beautiful idea. I bet you thought that the illustrations for this talk were going to look more like this rather than Mallarmé. But no, I wanted to start with Mallarmé because there really should have been a moment when humanists allowed themselves to feel profoundly vindicated by the recent history of AI. Everything we were saying about science systems and collective structures turns out to be true and important and useful, in fact. And it's also important to say, I think, this was not the dominant research program in 20th century artificial intelligence. The field is named artificial intelligence because the guiding hypothesis was they were modeling something called intelligence that was supposed to be an attribute of individual brains. And I have to add here a little bit biographically that part of the reason I know this and remember this, maybe resent it, I don't know, is that my father worked on AI during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So I remember the field's original commitment to studying mental representations and rules of reasoning rather than the kind of contingent, historically cluttered artifacts like books, which are going to be encrusted with all kinds of accidents. What you wanted to understand intelligence itself was not books, but something simplified like the blocks world, seen here in a program developed by Terry Winograd, a space where the true primitive operations of reasoning would be more legible. Some people in computational disciplines are still disappointed that we didn't produce AI by starting at this level, but started instead with 100 million contingent examples of human behavior. You can feel that tension persisting, for instance, in the well-known 2021 paper on the dangers of stochastic parrots, a paper which is admirable in its history of production and has many good things to say. And I even agree, in fact, with this passage. But one of the things that troubles Bender and her co-authors is that language models have no communicative intent, which I think is true, especially in 2021. Like GPT-3, part of the problem is they had no model of what a conversation was or what communication was. They had to be taught to have conversations. But I find it ironic when humanists rally around stochastic parrots, because in doing that, they're rallying around a critique of AI that grounds meaning in the individual subject, communicative intention, and opposing a collective theory of meaning that their own disciplines invented just at the moment when computer scientists are finally being forced to accept the theory that we created. Don't worry, I'm not going to stay at this level of abstraction throughout the talk. I am going to get more concrete and practical. I know that most of us don't really care whether Michel Foucault would feel vindicated by large language. He totally would. But I understand that what we care about is whether there's a place for us in this new world concretely. And I'm going to suggest that there's a practical role for the humanities to play here. But I wanted to start at the level of principle because I think it's important to be clear that we are not just sort of opportunistically accommodating ourselves to ideas that we should be opposed to. On the contrary, these were our ideas. Computer scientists accommodated themselves to the reality that language is what matters, or at least is very useful. Intelligence, I'm sure there are things intelligence can do, that the brain can do, that you can't get just from language itself. But language is super useful. So I want to make clear that we're starting with that, not just accommodating ourselves to our, we're starting with Mallarmé, not Kent Brockman, partly because these models aren't really about algorithms. They are about language. That's what makes them work. The algorithms are very general. The insights that the models are going to express are not in the transformer algorithm itself. Okay. Because generative AI is about culture, there has to be a place for us in this world. Generative AI is a model of culture. But why does that matter practically? Well, to start with, it means that to improve these models, to steer them or to reshape them, is mostly a matter of improving the data they're trained on. There are algorithmic improvements still happening, and they will be important, but a lot of them are about making the modeling process more efficient or the models smaller. They don't necessarily in themselves make the model smarter. To improve the model's content very often is a matter of improving the data. And people who work on this are spending a lot of their time on the data. How do we know this, by the way? A little sidebar that will introduce a theme that is going to become more important as we go along. In 2022, if I had given this talk, I would have assumed, and I think everyone would have rightly assumed, we don't really know how they're producing these models. It's happening in Google and OpenAI, who knows what they're doing, what they're working on. That's changed in 2024. There are open models produced in part by corporations like Meta, where the openness is part of a sort of deliberate brand strategy, but also by academic or semi-academic institutions like Allen AI in Seattle, where they really are producing the model and sharing the data and showing everything they did to produce it. And to be really blunt and concrete about it, if we were playing 6 degrees of separation, there are only 1 or 2 degrees of separation between literary scholars and historians and people who work at Allen AI. There are probably people I can point to in this room who know people who work at Allen AI. So we have a window into how these things are being done now. So what is being done to improve the models? To start with filtering data, when we started building language models, companies were just grabbing everything they could off the web. But it turns out there's a lot of garbage on the internet that you don't really want to be training on. It's not optimal. It's not the behavior you want to produce for a range of reasons. So filtering is a big, big task, but also maybe less well publicized or less obvious. You may need to add data that no human being ever produced. The idea that language models are just parrots has fostered an assumption that the sort of ideal data for a language model would be as natural, as close to authentic, spontaneous human action as possible. But in fact, authentic, natural human action is often very unedifying. Like, how do we caption photos? This is Jessica in Cancun. That's sufficient for me. But if you're training an image model or a text-to-image model, it would be much more helpful to know that she's standing, to the right of a thatched structure, that there are high rises in the background, which might not otherwise get, it's easy to synthetically generate captions that are much more useful to train on than what human beings really do. And much of the improvement in image models took place by making better captions. Similar things are true about like mathematical reasoning and coding. Synthetic data is important in those areas. So you filter data, you may add new data. Also, if you look at the paper that Meta released, talk about how they produced their own open source language model, a big part of it is deciding what is high quality data, ranking data by quality, which is obviously an issue. It's going to raise controversies. And then balancing, like, how much of this kind of data should we have versus how much, like toward the bottom, they say like 50% tokens, general knowledge, 25% mathematical and reasoning, 17% code. They're making really arbitrary choices there about the composition of culture, rebalancing it. And then the final thing you might do is supervised fine-tuning to make the models conversational. So they know, like, I'm supposed to take turns and so on. So I don't think I really have to persuade you at this point that the decisions that are being made here are decisions that are consequential for the humanities. The relation between cultural artifacts and human behavior, how they help shape new patterns of behavior or vice versa, is central to what we study. And people who train language models in doing things like this, rebalancing culture, are going to be making decisions like, oh, you know what, let's have less fiction in this data set because we find it makes the model hallucinate. Or maybe let's put more fiction in the data set because we find it produces more theory of mind. And we cannot be out of the loop when people run those experiments and make decisions like that. Or we will lose our ability to claim that we are the experts about the role of fiction and history and philosophy in human culture. Those are going to be, whether we want to stop those experiments or learn from them or steer them, we need to be in the room. But as I say, I probably don't have to, one other thing, that what they're doing is producing like the first encyclopedia of Tlon. This is like an alternate version of culture. This is not just passively mirroring human culture. It's making some active choices. But as I say, I don't have to convince you this is important. Where I think we may have some doubt, legitimate doubt, is whether humanists are realistically going to get a chance to participate in this conversation and intervene in it. And Here, I would start by saying we don't have to wait for an invitation. I am going to end up arguing that computer scientists can be receptive, but I don't think waiting for an invitation is the way this works. And in fact, what I want to say really is that people are already doing this. People with a background in the humanities are already publishing papers in computational linguistics conferences and AI conferences that intervene in questions about modeling of human culture. So for instance, this one looks at who drops out when the internet is filtered for quality. Some of these authors do have a background in CS, but some of them, like Lauren Klein, have a background in the humanities. And the first author, Lucy Lee, is studying information science, a field that can bridge from the humanities to computer science. She's also in the job market this year. You can hire her. But if this is too many computer scientists, let's back up a couple of years and look at Lauren Klein's extremely influential book with Catherine D'Ignazio. Had an impact across a number of fields, including people who work on AI, data feminism. Or look at this paper, which was published in a conference about natural language processing that translates narrative theory, narratology, into terms that will be comprehensible and useful for people who are studying language computationally. The lead authors are humanists working in humanities departments. Now, are any of these publications going to change the way Meta trains language models? Not immediately, but some of them might well change the way Allen AI in Seattle does, because one of the co-authors on the first paper is from Allen AI. And then you're like 1 degree of separation from people at Meta and Google. I'm talking so candidly about social networks because I want to acknowledge that networks do matter here. I want to talk about people more than abstract methods. You'll notice that all the publications I just listed are co-authored. Co-authorship is the norm in computational disciplines, partly because computational projects require a lot of grunt work. But co-authorship can also be a good thing for humanists coming into this conversation, because it means we don't have to come in cold. We can pick up the stylistic and generic norms of a new field by learning from colleagues and collaborators. And if you want, at the end of the talk, we can talk about like, what exactly do you have to learn? Is it necessary to learn statistics? But I don't want to talk too much about that, because as I say, I want to focus on the concrete social relationships and not, abstract method wars, quantitative, qualitative. I want to talk about the relationships that can be built between people who study human culture and people who study AI. Building networks of collaborators is its own kind of work, and I know these networks are not equally accessible to everyone. If you're a doctoral student, for instance, you probably can't do this on your own. So when I say this network building is tough, but we can do it, I don't mean that you, second-year doctoral student, should go do this next month, nor do I mean that you, eminent full professor who spent your life studying French Impressionism, should forget about Impressionism and just rebuild your research agenda around AI. I'm definitely not recommending that. I just mean that we collectively, as people who study culture, are building a bridge to computational disciplines, because some of us are building specific links, and network connections are transitive. So you don't have two separate, it's not us and them anymore. There is actually a bridge. And it's on that scale, on the collective scale, that I want to stress that we don't have to wait for an invitation. And this is actually the hidden message in the publicity image we use to advertise this talk. Sarah Varney did a fabulous job with it, by the way. Thank you. I did suggest the subject, and there was a secret reason why I chose Casablanca rather than a more hackneyed image of human-machine cooperation like that. And the reason is that I hope you'll remember looking at the last scene of Casablanca where they walk off together into the fog, and it's the beginning of a beautiful friendship between Rick and Louis Renault, Captain Louis Renault. I hope you'll remember, at least some of us, that the immediately preceding scenes are Major Strasser trying to shoot Rick firing back, hitting him, and Louis Renault saying, Major Strasser has been shot. Does anyone remember the next line?
The usual stuff.
Thank you. In other words, Rick and Louis do not start out as friends. Louis does not invite Rick to, run off together. Their friendship is an alliance of necessity that happens because Rick forced the issue by shooting the Nazi major. Apologies for the spoiler, people who don't watch great movies. But the point is, humanists are probably also going to have to force the issue. I'm not saying that we will get an invitation, not by shooting anyone, but by networking and by actively showing that we have something of value to contribute to this conversation. But the title of my talk, or at least the original title, was also Why AI Needs the Humanities. I changed it to the two as partners because that seemed more. But I do also want to say that AI needs the humanities and we are needed as a partner. And that if we play our hands right, we will find partners who are as receptive, at least, as Louis Renault. Why is there a need for us? Let me start with the piece of it we already know about, because this is true and valid, even if it's what we already know. Sometimes a project is not a good idea, and someone needs to be in the room, like Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, to say, don't clone dinosaurs. I don't know if that person needs to be a humanist or if they can be a specialist in chaos theory, like Goldblum's character was. But yes, sometimes a critic is needed, and sometimes the reason we're needed is to do critique or just say stop. However, this part of it, while valid, is what I think we all already know. And I'm not here to underline stuff we already know. So I'm going to spend the remainder of the time in the talk talking about something less obvious, which is that there are also constructive roles for people who study culture to play in building generative AI. We are needed not only to say, don't do this, but sometimes potentially to help people figure out how to do it. For instance, if you say these are models of culture, the very obvious question is, whose culture? The world is a diverse place. The internet is not a random sample of it. People are going to bring different beliefs and customs to their interaction with generative AI products, and sometimes want a product that mirrors their own point of view, which right now they really don't get. They get a product that mirrors sort of Google PR's sense of what they ought to, what the average customer will probably want. Right now, commercial products are bad not only at getting outside of Western norms, they're even bad at understanding the diversity of a Western tradition. So for instance, if you ask a chatbot, what were the problems in England in the 1790s and describe them as someone at the time would do, you get this ridiculous pastiche of oldie-fashioned rhetoric. Ah, dear reader, permit me to discourse on the matters most pressing. No one in the 1790s, I studied British Romanticism, that's my background. No one talked like that. And you don't have to study British Romanticism to know that no one talked like that. There are a lot of overlapping problems here. And we could talk about why models are so bad at this. But you can sum them up by saying that right now, AI is not terribly good at cultural pluralism. Even within like one cultural tradition, it can't envision a different period or it's not very good at committing itself fully to an alternate role. This is going to limit, obviously, what we can use the models for in humanities education and research, because inhabiting alternate perspectives is a big part of what we do. But it's also a commercial problem if users want something more attuned to their own perspective. And computer scientists are becoming aware of this, companies and academic computer scientists as well. So you see bat signals go up like this post on Blue Sky from David Mimno just a couple of weeks ago. He was at a computer science conference and he heard a speaker say, we want these language models to have a better representation of culture, but the only thing is, what is culture? Which is actually a hard question, but it is also a bat signal for humanists. And David is a computer scientist, and he's not alone in recognizing that they need help here. There's a large number of papers and conversations where you can trace the recognition that we are getting out of our depth in this particular problem. So I want to describe two aspects of this to help us understand like how we can constructively contribute to solving this problem in a better way, critiquing it, but also maybe we could show people how to do things better. In doing that, in case there are any computer scientists in the room, and also just out of intellectual honesty, I want to acknowledge that computer scientists are not foolish people who can't think about issues. They are thinking very hard and well about this issue. So for instance, this is a paper mostly by computer scientists that came out earlier this year, where they try to think through the issue of cultural pluralism, or the code phrase in CS is sometimes pluralistic alignment, and rightly acknowledge that pluralism itself is not a straightforward word. There could be different ways of being pluralistic. Like, here's the Overton window, the accepted range of points of view, just don't go outside it. Or maybe instead you want something that's steerable, like I'm not gonna just sort of have these limits, but if the user tips me over into this point of view, I can start to adopt their point of view. This is one of the valid perspectives, but you have to steer me to it. Or maybe social scientists will want like a more statistical representation of like 40% of the time I think this because 40% of people think that. I don't know if users want that, but social scientists might. And this is actually, I think, a good and thoughtful paper on this issue. It's not that they need help because they're foolish or don't recognize that concepts are contested, but their tradition is not our tradition. So there are limits to the way they imagine culture. You can see implicitly here that a lot of these statements are normative statements, like what should be done? Is it okay for the government to do this? And this is a very strong, very consistent theme in the CS papers I've seen over the last couple of years about cultural adaptability. They almost always use examples of norms, rules of etiquette, like here, is it okay to eat with your left hand in India, or moral injunctions. This paper is even called NORMAD, normative adaptability, and they slide back and forth very quickly between culture and norm. I think if you're a historian or a literary scholar or an art historian, you think of culture as in broader terms than that, as including rhetorical forms, or maybe even intellectual habits, like a syllogism could be a cultural form that shapes how models reason. Certainly, styles and rhetoric are part of culture. So why is it that computer scientists are limited to thinking of culture as something normative? That means they're not going to recognize how many choices being made here are culturally specific. They're only going to see the normative part. I think part of the reason may be, there are many reasons, but part of the reason may be that we and culture collectively have leaned very heavily on this understanding of the interaction between science and culture and humanities, where culture is kind of a thou shalt not injunction. And that's valid, as I say, but I think for the interaction between AI and humanities to be as productive and exciting as it could be, I don't think we want to limit ourselves to interacting with it in a normative or critiquey way. I think we also want to push computer scientists by reminding them that they could be thinking in more diverse ways, or producing models that can commit more fully to the bit in a way that can inhabit alternate perspectives, or more playful or lively, or there's a wide range of things they could do. Thinking culturally can actually mean recognizing the possible diversity of human experience. As I said at the beginning, it's sort of what's exciting about the humanities is that unfolds concretely through history. So just to take one concrete example, and then I'll end. Humanists are beginning to produce, I will say digital humanists, because this is someone who began in digital humanities, is now working for a startup, are beginning to produce language models that can do a better job of historical ventriloquism than the commercial offerings do. Pierre-Carl Langlais in France, about a year ago, I think, produced a model called Monad GPT, which he tuned on 17th century French and English prose. It's not perfect, but I think it provides a more credible simulation of early modern habits of thought than ChatGPT does. it recognizes, for instance, that there are only 6 planets, and it doesn't make a big fuss of flowery rhetoric, although it spells near with 2 E's.
But it's saying that the sun is the planet. So
It's not perfect. And part of the reason it's not perfect is that all he's done here is tune the model. He's taken a commercial model and tuned it on 17th century French and English prose. But what you would actually have to do is train it from scratch only on period texts in order to really get it into the period. And that's what I'm going to do when I get back to Illinois. That's my next project, and that's something I think we should be doing is producing our own language models trained from scratch. Tuning won't be enough. So that's one additional path we need to take here. Another is, like I said, this seems to me more authentic than ChatGPT, but how do I know that? Like, how do we measure that? Do we have benchmarks for cultural authenticity? Not really. We should produce those. We could be the people who produce those.
So do you envision language models like appliances that you would use for different things?
Yeah. I mean, there's one on my laptop. They don't all have to just live in the cloud, and they don't all have to just be one. No, yeah. They can be, no, whether for this kind of thing, like whether you're going to need a language model for each period, or whether we can eventually produce one that is flexible enough to say, like, okay, I've heard about the Apollo project, but if you ask me how to get to the moon, I have to say, use a powerful cannon because I'm pretending to be. That's a very hard thing to do, to pretend to forget about something you've actually seen. We can do it right now. These models can't at all. So the simpler path right now, if you wanted to do a 17th or 18th century model, would be just train it on the period. But definitely many different models for different things, not just one. So I'm 2 slides to go. I'll say one thing we can do. I promise not to stroll too far away from the camera. One thing we can do when we train our own period-specific models is use them, and here I'm going to sort of put back on my distant reader hat a little bit. We can use them to explore history, because if you can generate many alternate versions of culture, you can test, like, we were curious about the influence of this one writer. She's said to have a big influence on these documents. Well, what if we train a model of this period without her writings and compare it to one trained with them? How much difference does that make? That kind of counterfactual will have limits, but I want to find out what the limits are. I definitely want to explore what happens if we can generate counterfactual versions of cultural history. That's the sort of application toward research that I envision. But the more fundamental reason, the thing I've been stressing throughout, is just that this is we're at a point in history where culture, for good or ill, and probably both, has become malleable and instrumentalizable. People are editing task-specific versions of culture for particular business or intellectual missions. That's scary. It can have bad consequences for sure. It could create toxic subcultures. It could create a bland, homogenized culture that's sort of common denominator. But it's also potentially enormously consequential in a way that I didn't really expect would happen when I was studying British Romanticism, that, like, culture becomes this, that we can change the world with it, as Marx suggested. I would point out that, like, Marx's version of changing the world also had unintended negative consequences. You don't know in advance what they'll be. But I'm not trying to argue that the consequences will only be good. Another reason why I chose Casablanca as the publicity image is that this is a picture from 1942, and they're not walking off to a happy ending. They're walking off and still have to live through 1943, 4, and 5. So there will probably be downsides, and they may well, I don't know, outweigh the upsides. All I'm suggesting is that the stakes of this moment are very high. People who study human culture will have to be involved in this. We may be involved through critique, through helping computer scientists develop better theories of cultural pluralism, or concretely by building our own models. But however it plays out, the humanities cannot afford to stand aloof, and I don't think we will. Bridges are already being built, and we stand at the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Thank you. Ready for the questions? Sure, yes. I won't call people's names. If I do, it'll become Grammy or something.
Okay, this was great, Ted. I was so inspired by you and by this talk and by your framing and the capaciousness and the generosity of your intellectual project. I think it's really refreshing. So my questions come from that admiration, but I'm going to be really instrumental. So the first is just, I love this image from Casablanca. So I'm assuming that Rick is the humanist and Strasser, the Nazi, is who? Is he like?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, Strasser is not in this picture. This is Louis Renault.
no, I get it. But the killing, this friendship, this
Yeah.
friendship is the consequence of killing the bad Nazi. And I'm just curious who the bad Nazi is in the metaphor. And this is not, yeah, I'm not just saying this as a joke.
Yeah, no, I mean, so that's, I will say, like, one of the darkest consequence I can envision of AI, and there are a bunch of them. The darkest one I can envision that I haven't mentioned is that it becomes sort of monopolized. And in a bunch of ways it could happen, intellectual property law, or just by patent law, or just monopoly. And then we all have to, if we want to be smart and productive, we have to pay $1,000 a month for Microsoft. And people who do are actually more productive.
Right.
That's a scary world.
Right. So it was actually around productivity that I was hoping to get, because the last part of your talk had this really provocative and I think helpful way of saying that, look, the humanities could be the guidelines and the guardrails of the work that CS folks do. They know culture is not, that their models aren't great. We can help them make it better. So I think that's really helpful. What I was thinking, and this is the instrumental part of my question, with my graduate students, I always say, well, or my undergrads, I'll say, well, find a gap in the research. That could be your project. And then you can, tinker away at that. Could I, as an author for my next book, just say, all right, I'm writing a book on X, give me 5 chapters, right? Is the data on which generative AI is based good enough? Or do I need to come to UTED and sit at that conference that we did not so long ago, and right?
I don't think, I mean, what Alison Goldfield would say, and I agree with her about this, is that these models are not terribly good at innovating. She's a little bit more strict about that than I would be, because there's more than one way of innovating, and sometimes there are things that are implicit in existing discourse that you can glimpse connections or something. But if you want to write a book, generative AI is not going to. You're saying something new that people haven't said yet. Generative AI is not going to know what to say. So I don't think it will help us be more productive in that way. I'm not either afraid or optimistic about that particular thing. Now, there's so much that we do that doesn't require being genuinely innovative, though, right? You writing a book is the hardest case there, right? But most of the stuff we write, it's like an email, it's letter of recommendation. Yes. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the talk. I think I've very much been in a circle of kind of thinking about
Thank you.
the potential of AI, and kind of feeling like humanists are shouting into a wall that isn't hearing. So this is really lovely to hear. I want to touch more on the more practical side of getting computer scientists and humanists to work together.
Yeah.
Because it is definitely true that a lot of us are only in 3 degrees of separation from each other. But then the other question becomes in order to do meaningful collaboration, computer scientists have to learn the language of the humanities, and humanists have to learn the language of computer sciences. And I found that at the very least, having worked with humanists in terms of trying to bridge that gap, people at least at the very start, are very, very apprehensive about the idea of even touching code. And my friends who are more on the STEM side of things, not necessarily in computer science, also feel that same apprehension towards humanities. What is like your idea about kind of resolving that gap, like the kind of fear-based gap that I think a lot of people are experiencing?
I don't know that I have, I mean, you're describing it very well. I don't know that I have a magic answer for it, because it's just, that's sort of, it's, you know, people just getting used to, it's partly just getting out of your own comfort zone, and also people just figuring out concretely how to work with specific other people, and you don't want to step on toes. That's also part of it. Like, it's not an abstract question. I think you're just describing it well, but I think what I can contribute is just a recognition that it is working. It is, I feel like networks are growing and have grown over the last 10 years that didn't exist before. Yeah.
I'm very ignorant of this, but you mentioned the word hallucination once. How about those hallucinations of AI systems? Are
Yes.
they in fact not just parroting, but
Yes.
creative? Anybody analyze the quality of hallucinations?
Yeah, and people are interested in it. There's a lot of interest in that. I think you could say that I hear people say that you wouldn't want to completely shut down the capacity to hallucinate, because it also is what produces a capacity to take like unexpected paths in a model. And there probably is some truth to that. Yes. I don't know if hallucination is exactly the same thing as creativity. I'll defer that to psychologists. There are various, ideas. Computer scientists have various ideas about how hallucination might be reduced, which might or might not work.
But I've heard that they're basically trying to stamp it out. You want to avoid that in some way, do better training, get bigger data. But I was wondering, that might be the creative thing, that it's actually synthesizing.
Yeah, I mean, so I studied history of science in grad school in the 90s, and sometimes I'm frustrated that we don't know the answers to things, but sometimes I remember my history of science professors back in the 90s who sort of taught me to basically that it's always like this, that people always say the air pump doesn't work, that's you have a bad air pump, your air pump is different from ours, and all that. We're having that kind of argument right now about exactly this question. There's a group of people out there who are saying, actually, there's some, if you look at the probabilities assigned to words, we can choose some moments to be creative and other moments where we don't know what we're talking about, and we should just, so there's an interesting debate going on about how to handle uncertainty in language models, but the verdict is not in. Jim.
I really like your kind of vision in the AI world of happy collaborations. But the way you're describing, and this is for purposes of your emphasis in this talk,
Yes.
I understand, but it's easy for me to imagine the room as like mostly humanists. These things, and like the coding part, it's trivial, and there's a couple of guys in the back doing the coding, but this isn't really how I think we should envision it. And so
that's
can
right.
you talk a little bit more about like the coding side and I don't know, like the ratios or proportions or relationships of power?
Yeah. Let's think that through. I think it's really kind of complicated because we're interested in the disciplinary tension between us and computer scientists. That's what's closest to us. They're just across the quad. But then there's a whole different conflict that's with like product managers and customers, and how do we actually make money on this? And that's a different set of people and a different set of questions. And like who actually has power and who is actually steering, but definitely the people where money gets involved is who actually has power and is steering. And I also think it's true that to come back to the part we know more about, like quantitative, qualitative, coding disciplines, those who aren't. I also think it's true. I downplayed this in the talk, and I even sort of flagged the moment when I downplayed it. But I do think it's true that it will be a handicap not to know how things are done, because you can't just tell them, you know, make the model. Could you make the model more creative in some way? Because they don't know what creative means. We don't actually know what, if we had to operationalize it, what creative means. Does it just mean more random? Probably not. You kind of have to know something about how the model is doing things in order to build that bridge between, like, we would like more diversity or more creativity, and what does that concretely mean? So I do think it is the thing I've swept under the bed, then I even sort of said, I'm sweeping this under the bed, is that these collaborations do depend on creating a common language. And yes, there are, because the algorithms do keep changing, and when the algorithm gets better, it gets much faster and much smaller and less expensive and less electricity. Yeah, a lot of energy is going to go into making better algorithms. But they have been spending a huge amount of energy on the data too, and probably more in terms of just person hours. Now that means not just sort of doing humanist work. It means some data janitorial work, like how do we filter out duplication? How do we, but I mean, of course, the bridge looks clear for me because as a digital humanist, I've had to do tons of data janitorial work myself, filtering out duplication and so on. So if there are intermediate shades of gray there, but yeah, it's not, I did not give you a representative sample of papers from AI conferences. Those were with humanists. Yeah, in the back, and then Jake. Both. Yeah.
So I'm a student at Temple University, double majoring in neuroscience, and computer science and physics. And in my last 2 years of high school, I took an intense literary course on modernism, and that's how I developed an interest in postmodernism's consciousness of schizophrenia. So one of my interests is using analyzing patterns in literature from postmodernism's consciousness of schizophrenia to learn more about the illness of schizophrenia. But like, if I'm being transparent, as an undergrad,
to learn more about, you said something quickly that I don't know, the iliac. You're illness of schizophrenia. I thought it was a particular brain structure. Okay, go on. Yes.
so like, if I'm being transparent, I'm as undergrad, like fairly amateur when it comes to research. But I do want to, like, I go to Temple University, and from my observation, the fields are the departments are fairly compartmentalized. I don't know how it works at Penn exactly, but that's like my environment at least.
Yeah.
And so if I want to like engage, like I've tried engaging with professors, but they have like knowledge gaps. Like they'll know about one field, not about another. And
Yeah.
your talk is practically about AI and like humanities collaboration.
Yes.
And so like for someone who's like an undergraduate and like they know which niche area they want to work in, but they have a lot of knowledge gaps, so they want guidance, like how do they like navigate that?
Man.
Great question.
That is a super good question, because you're right that there's like not many professors who are going to have all the knowledge that you're looking for. Oh man, that's hard. You can ask ChatGPT. It will know a little bit about both subjects, but I don't know if that I'm seriously recommending that. That's really hard, especially you're an undergraduate. That's super hard. Does anyone else have good ideas about that? There might be someone you're probably interested in that because someone at the school suggested the possibility of cross-disciplinary.
It was like research interest that I developed on my own,
Oh,
and like especially in high school and like learning about modernism, and like I'm originally like well, my origins are in humanities, but it was after like being into humanities that I developed an interest in.
And there is lots of literary discourse about psychology in both modernism and postmodernism, like because of the Great War and so on. You might be able to find, there will be people, if not at a temple somewhere, who are thinking about schizophrenia and either modernism or postmodernism. That's interdisciplinary, but it's not so recondite that there's no one out there. You might have to email someone, but.
Medicine. Interdisciplinary centers.
Yeah, Yeah, there are literature and medicine centers. But congrats, that sounds fun.
This is a question from a person who knows very little about how exactly these models work. But you mentioned a concept by Wittgenstein, which is language games at the beginning. And Wittgenstein came to my mind as one of the few philosophers of his time who actually argued about the basic dependence of language on embodied practice.
Yes.
Through his notion of form of life.
Mm.
So I'm wondering about the process of translation from culture as a form of life, where language is always secondary to practice and embodied life. The process of translation of this kind of like understanding of culture, I mean, of this kind of environment in which language circulates and has been circulating historically into this kind of disembodied kind of algorithm world.
Yeah.
It's a general question, but I'm also wondering about the reverse process of translation. What might AI do to our culture if it increasingly fits into our everyday life?
Yeah.
Disembodied language and reasoning.
You know, just to address the latter part first, you know that scientists are now using the word delve more. Or that they started out just chatbots. You could tell something was by a chatbot because it would say, let's delve into that some more. But now we're picking that up. So there's a slide I didn't include, but could have, is there's I think it was a Nature article headline, Machine Culture, that's going to try to study exactly this. Like, what about the cycle when we shape machines and then they shape us? That's potentially a whole area of study. They will shape us. Your first question is very tricky and controversial because the question of whether meaning has to be grounded in concrete experiences is an old philosophical one. And a few years back, people were saying, well, you know, these language models won't really be able to understand things until they have connections to sort of vision, sound. They're now multimodal, so they have those connections. And it hasn't changed that much about the way they use language, but there are still kinds of embodiment they certainly lack. And we find common sense fails in language models in places where, like, how, you know, can you fit a giraffe into a car? And it's not something that you can find written down in libraries because people haven't tried it, but we know, you know. So yeah, there's embodiment matters. Even though we have multimodal models, we still don't have all the kinds of embodiment we might wish. Maybe we'll find out more how much it matters when we have more, you know, more concretely embodied models. But it's an interesting question. JD.
Yeah, just been thinking about the dependence of these recent breakthroughs on scale.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that forecloses the kind of research that your dad was doing back in the day. Like maybe rule-based or cognitive kind of models will come back. But since we're dependent on scale, it means for these things to work, you sort of need a hegemonic world in order to build these. You need languages that are spoken by hundreds of millions of people. Like, you can't just skip to doing it in Quechua or Basque. And so I guess, like, the question is, when it comes to building in, what if you want to capture something about Quechua culture? Like, I know how a person would do that.
Yeah.
But for AI, is there something like structurally impossible about that using the current method? And if not, like, what do you, like, are they structurally hegemonic by necessity by how they're built? Or is there something you can do to get around that? And, like, maybe that's an area that humans should be doing something?
So this is really concretely relevant to me because I am now trying to build period-specific models. And the question is very much like, how far back can you go before you run out of enough training material? And I think, you know, somewhere in the early modern period, it would get dicey. It's not a problem like late 19th, early 20th century, but using current methods somewhere in the early modern period or with very low resource languages, if you were training just on that, it will get dicey. But we also probably don't want to be in a position forever where we have to train every model from scratch. Like, you've never heard about up or down before. You've never heard about, you know, in and out. We're going to give you 5 million blog posts and make you relearn all of that from scratch. Probably in the long run, we want our models that are capable of being flexible and that can do what we can do, which is like, yes, I know about the Apollo project, but I'm going to forget about the Apollo project, remember about the difference between up and down, and now read this text in a time when I know people didn't know about the Apollo project. And ultimately, these models, I don't think it's impossible. I don't think there's something structurally impossible about doing it. And I have sort of a bunch of ideas about how we might make it more possible, but we have to find out if they work. But I think that should be what we aim for low resource languages and older periods both. How many more? Okay, Wendy.
Thanks so much for your talk. I have a question. So I'm really taken by your idea of training models to model different historical perspectives. And I think that's really exciting, even with the problems and caveats that you mentioned, but I can kind of see that as an exciting area of research and some potential there. And I'm just wondering how you see that in conversation with some of the critical AI work being done. Like I'm thinking of Tim Gebru's work, or in the broader field like Sophia Noble and people like this who are, you know, really kind of operating from the AI space, but really have a critical theoretical perspective that's humanities, like feeding from the humanities.
Yes.
And so like, it's almost like that there's like two models of the humanities I'm seeing, because yours is very different. And I think in some ways their critique is taking for granted that like AI should model the world as we want it to be, right? So we need to remove things that train models to be racist, right? We need to remove gender discrimination, things like that,
Right.
so that we don't replicate what's bad about culture, right? Like that's the argument. But that seems like that kind of method is kind of in contrast to what you're saying. We're almost like harnessing the trainability of the models.
I mean, to be blunt, what I'm suggesting we do with AI is the same thing I suggested we do with machine learning, which is like model different human perspectives. I was on that shtick last decade, and I'm just sort of adapting it to AI. And I do think that's like, as a historicist, that I'm on that shtick because I'm a historicist, but I don't think it's incompatible with what Gebru and others in critical AI are saying. It's true that if you look back at stochastic parrots, that paper is very much like, let's exclude the bad stuff. But that was, 4 years ago. And I think I would have to take a look, but I suspect that the institutions that they're running are a little bit more focused on diversity, like active diversity, rather than just filtering out bad stuff, just because the world has changed a bit. And it's become clear that actually corporations are pretty good at filtering out bad stuff, and sometimes all too good. So I do think these are compatible. Like I stress that we shouldn't just be negative, but I do think also being negative is good. Yeah. And then Laura, yeah.
Yeah, I was curious to hear what your thoughts would be about how we might need to educate people about AI moving forward. Is this something where it requires its own class, it gets worked in curricula, like across the curriculum? Is it just something like email where we assume people will figure this out on their own? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I wonder if I should just defer that for the faculty senate meeting where because we're all going to fight about that, right? I don't know that I have the right answer, but those are good questions. I mean, I definitely do think we should be fighting about that, because all students should be learning something about this. And whether it's a critical AI course or whether it starts by teaching them about machine learning and the sort of really like what it is to train a model, we will fight about that. I don't know that I have it's a political question, really. I don't know that I have expertise, but it's an important one. Laura.
Yeah, thanks for this talk, Ted. This is really, really wonderful. My question kind of dovetails with Whitney's. I turned to JD as soon as you were done and said, like, I feel like such an idiot because I'm not sure why this is controversial. Just like a good indication of how much you've influenced my thinking about this topic. But you know, and thinking kind of along with Whitney, I was thinking about the domains where I see this controversy working most clearly, which is in the space of publishing. And I hear the arguments being rehearsed about AI and generative AI compromising kind of the basis of human creativity, which I find so silly for all of these reasons that you listed. It's impossible to study early 20th century language games, for instance, and to think about the generative AI as somehow, you know, opposed to histories of literary creativity. So as I was thinking through, like, why don't I get this controversy? Why don't I get this problem? It seems that the actual problem, the actual controversy here is not around, at least in publishing, around the generative AI, but on who's profiting from this. It's around the matter of money. And I think this is kind of getting at like the difference between like where Timnit J. Brew is coming at this situation and where you might be. So you gave this really great example that I loved about kind of historical counterfactuals, which seems to make a whole lot of sense in the context of a university. I don't know how that makes a whole lot of sense in the context of industry. And so to me, the central conflict is not necessarily the humanities and the sciences, but the industry and the academy.
Probably.
And so I guess there's three ways I kind of want to frame my question for you, which is one, where are you imagining that this friendship is situated? In Casablanca, or is it in Paris, or some other place? And then I suppose the more aggressive way of asking the question, more pointed way of asking the question, which I know you know is just friendly fire, is like, does this require massive selling out on our part? So I guess, yeah, help me think about.
Yeah, that's, I did hint, like I said humanists and computer scientists often, but I did hint that like Pierre-Carl Langlais is at a startup, and we know lots of other digital humanists, he's at Playas in Paris, as it happens. We'll always have Paris. There are lots of digital humanists now working for industry or for startups. So it's not just a random abstract question. It's concrete. Like we probably can build alliances with industry. We are actually building alliances with industry in some cases. So, and you're also right that very often academic computer scientists are just as angry about industry as we are, or maybe more so because they're closer to it. So I don't, I mean, concretely, the papers that I showed were mostly, the closest they got to industry was Allen AI, which is kind of a public-private collaboration. But I think I'm just saying this is a good question, and the answer to it will be complex. And it's likely that people will, you know, if accepting a grant from Google or Amazon is selling out, then people are going to need to make some decisions about that, because that's some of the money that will be involved in doing that. It probably won't be all just public sector.
And so maybe, sorry,
Yeah.
But could you like just articulate then for me then, like, what is the value proposition then of the humanities for industry?
Well, I mean,
like, what is the value of that friendship? If the humanities is constantly the police, right? Like you can and can't do this.
But they have so right now the central example here is that right now they have a problem. Their customers are culturally diverse. They have customers who have many different assumptions about, you know, how many people should I invite to my son's wedding, and should I be paying for my son's wedding? And that's a problem for them, actually. And I don't know if it's us or if it's social scientists or if it's just their PR department, but I hope it's not just their PR department, because they'll do a bad job of it. They need to solve the problem of either personalizing models or making them culturally flexible, or there are some deep principled questions to address there. And right now, they really don't even have a theory of what they're trying to do. So I do actually think that research on like how to make models more culturally flexible, that's a value proposition. If we could do that. Yeah. I don't necessarily know, but that's how it should be funded. But yes. Have I exhausted all the questions?
I have one from
From
an online viewer.
okay.
Sorry, I make it better. Do you have any thoughts about the extent to which LLMs reflect economic diversity?
Economic interests?
Diversity,
Economic diversity. They don't. I don't. And one of the things that Lucy Lee proves in her paper looking at like the quality filters is it's not accidental. It's not just, oh, most of the people who are on the internet are from these countries or from these income brackets. But the quality filtering, she demonstrates, actively filters out minoritized perspectives. So, as well as probably, people with less economic power. So yeah, definitely. But that's partly a choice. And on that note, thank you very much.